Hi, everyone. I'm Beverly Price, and this is Divorce Coalition Live. We're a show dedicated to improving the divorce experience for the domestic abuse survivor. And we want to do this through education, process change, and awareness among the divorce professional and court communities. The Divorce Coalition is a nonprofit organization dedicated to this. We want to create a more supportive and less traumatic divorce experience. Studies show that most domestic abuse survivors coming through divorce actually feel that not only are they traumatized in their relationship, but traumatized again during the divorce process. We feel that knowledge is power in creating change in the world of domestic abuse. So without further ado, let's get started. In today's world, so many divorce professionals may run into a victim of domestic abuse. And it's important to understand not only the technical aspects of divorce abuse, such as the labels and the names, but also to learn to empathize and understand where that victim is coming from. In particular, I have a wonderful guest today, Joni Jones, who is a top expert in domestic abuse, and she's going to share with us what victims would really want divorce professionals to know and to do during the divorce process. Hi, Joni. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Beverly.
It's great to see you again.
And it's great to
Can
see
you
you.
tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background and your passion for domestic abuse?
Well, my name is Joni Jones, and I am a registered nurse. I've been a registered nurse for over 45 years. I am board certified in mental health and psychiatric nursing, and also I am a certified anger management specialist. I had worked over 10 years on a mental health unit where I have worked with many people that actually wanted to take their own life. You had to be suicidal to be on my unit. And there were so
Wow.
many consistencies with a background of abuse, domestic abuse, feeling like a failure, and just didn't think that they could go on and live anymore. And I just wanted to share too that I am a survivor of domestic violence, and it didn't happen to me once, it didn't happen to me twice, it didn't happen to me 3 times, and all
Right.
with different people. But one thing that allowed me to remain empowered was that how did I get myself in these situations? And it was simply because I believed people. Like, I'm a
Right.
very truthful person. And when somebody was telling me something, I gave them the benefit of the doubt, and I believed everything. And then that wasn't always the case. So I became part of that stereotype, where I just kept getting myself in these situations and people looked at me not in a powerful light. But I
Mhm.
am a survivor and I've gone through the experience. And even though everybody experiences things differently, I still have that frame of reference combined with being a mental health nurse.
Absolutely. And I'm right there with you. I'm a survivor of multiple experiences and multiple abusive relationships. And I know how difficult it is to not only walk through those, but to get to the other side and search for empowerment and growth. So that's just incredibly important.
Yes.
So if we go back to the kind of the overall theme, what would victims of domestic abuse want divorce professionals to know in about them and about the process?
Well, first of all, we have to be vigilant to what are some of the things to look for when there is a possible abuse.
Okay.
Um, because sometimes what happens is people don't say anything. They're,
Mhm.
they're ashamed.
Yeah.
And it's not something that they feel comfortable talking about. So those observations are very important. And there's a difference between if you know somebody or you don't know somebody. So if you do know somebody, I always say, look for a change in a person. And,
Okay.
and then, if you already have that trust and that rapport, then you can, say, hey, something looks like is on your mind, and if they want to talk about it, let them talk about it. But some of the overt signs where if you don't know somebody, one of the biggest things is you might see an injury. You might
Gotcha.
see like a black eye or something, and then they're making excuses for it. And
Right.
when I was in high school, I had abuse in my home, and I came in with a black eye, and they said, "Where did you get that black eye from?" And I said, "Oh, I got hit in the eye with a baseball." And
Right.
thank God I had people there that didn't believe that. And
Mhm.
they got me with a psychologist and everything else like that, where I could like open up and talk about it. But immediately I wasn't going to say, and the abuse was actually coming from my sister. So,
Right.
where my head was put through a window, and things of that nature. So, so being vigilant to something like that. Any
Okay.
type of, expression of somebody who like has low self-esteem, their eyes are cast downward, they may have like low energy, they're lacking the eye contact, or
Mhm.
they're constantly, checking in with their partner, whoever it is that's abusing them.
Right.
They're, you
Can't
know,
make their own decisions. Yeah.
exactly. And you might see that they are been made to be dependent. Like they may not have a car, they may not have money in their pocket. They may, there may be some controlling issues that are going on. And and maybe you might see them when they're with their abuser trying to overly servant them and
Uh-huh.
pleasing them and things of that. Or if somebody, even if it's an employer, if all of a sudden they start skipping out on work, um,
Mhm.
or school or social outings for no reason, there might be some underlying things that they're hiding.
Yeah, I think that in the divorce professional world, we have so many different types of professionals that may come in at different stages. For
Exactly.
example, when somebody's thinking of divorce, the first question might be, well, what happens with the family home? So then they might come into contact with a realtor or a lending professional. If they have children, they might be seeking out specialized help for the children, and on and on. Typically, I think a lot of us think of going straight to an attorney. And I personally believe that's appropriate when there's severe physical violence. But what we don't have a good handle on, I think, is all the other kinds of abuse that are more invisible. And I
Exactly.
think your points are very correct. We know now that it's all about power and control. And so what you may see are reactions to being dominated and fearful and that kind of thing.
Right. And if you walk into a home and you see, a hole in the wall that looks like a punch, or somebody
Yeah,
put their head through the wall, that might be another sign. So it's just
absolutely.
it's just about being vigilant.
Absolutely. So now if we go into what do we want the professionals to know that the victims want from them? What are some of the things? I think there's so much research that shows that a victim is having a negative experience in divorce. So what can divorce professionals do to change that?
Well, the first thing that I wanted to say is that they really want the professional who's serving them to be the solid object. And what I mean by that is, Beverly, if I came behind you and I pushed you,
Hmm.
instinctively, what you're going to do is you're going to try to grab onto anything, so
Right.
that you don't fall.
Hmm.
So, a person who is in crisis wants somebody that they can hold on to, that
Okay.
is, solid, that represents that strength. But what a person in crisis might do is they might test the emotional solidity of the person, to see if they can trust that. But it's
Okay.
very instinctively that they need that guidance. But the thing that I want to say about that is that you don't need to be perfect. You do not need to be like focused. Am I saying really this thing right or that thing wrong? The underlying message of that is that you really want to be honest and real. Because when you're honest and real, that's what's going to build the trust. That's what's going to build the rapport. And that's what's going to give the person who is assisting them the stimulus control.
Absolutely. So in reverse, if we say, what should a victim look for in a divorce professional? I would think it would be those same things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Because they need that modeling, they need that strength. And there's so many things that can happen. Like, for example, if we see people who start to stagnate, where they just can't move forward. People ask me all the time, why do we see that stagnation? And the answer is very simple. It's because their emotions are in control of them instead of them being in control of their emotions. And, the way that I look at this is that, we have these adrenal glands, which are our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. We're all born with it. It's our survival. And they really play a very important part when we get very emotional. And what I mean by that is we have a scale. Let's look at a 0 to 10 scale. And we get out of bed in the morning, we can be at a level 0, like maybe we have an event, we're very happy, nothing's happening to us that day. And then as the day goes on, that number can go from a 0 to a 3 to a 4, depending on what happens. Now, other people that may not be sleeping well, they're tossing and turning, they have a lot of things on their mind, they may be waking up at their level at a level 3. But when things start to happen, what people don't understand a lot of times is what happens to the brain when those numbers go up to a level 5. So we have what's called a sympathetic nervous system. So like if there was a fire and your adrenal glands are letting you know that there was a threat or a danger, you're going to, and respond. You're either going to run out the door, you might freeze. But with the way that it happens, we have physiological responses. So our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, our breathing goes up. Some people might get dizzy. Some people might lose their vision. Some people might throw up, and some people might really go into a panic attack. However, this is going to be the basis of everything. The fact of the matter is once you get above a level 5, you then enter into the side of the brain, which is the right side of the brain, that is very impulsive. And when you're in that side of the brain, you are now reacting on what you think is happening. So it's all the what ifs, and then you're escalating. But the problem when you're in this side of the brain is that there's no logical thinking. So there's no logical decision making, and people can't understand why they're talking for hours and hours and hours and they're not getting anywhere. They're stagnating in their conversation. But that's because they don't have the ability to do that when they're in that side of the brain. So what we want to do is we want to help them cross a bridge into the left side of the brain, because in the left side of the brain, this is where it's not impulsive. And this is where they're not reactionary. They're able to listen. They're able to look at facts. And this is where the logical decision making takes place. And I just want to mention that we are not born with knowledge. We are born with the ability to learn. But if we have never been shown something or taught something, we won't possibly know how to do it. And one of the big misconceptions is that they'll take medication or they might use essential oils. But what they do, and they have an important part, they may allow you to calm to the point where you can sit, attend, and focus, which are the prerequisites of learning. but there's no skill building in that. And if
Right.
there was like a medication or essential oil that skill builds, tell me about it, because I'd like to put some stock in it. So,
Exactly. Exactly. I liken it, and what I would want a professional to understand is to imagine for a moment that they are being held up by a robber with a gun pointed at them. And imagine the terror. Now, imagine that's happened every day for 10 years. And imagine what happens to you. Do you run? Do you not? And what it does to your emotional base. I think a lot of the things you talked about logical thinking versus emotional, are foundations going through any person going through divorce. But you add on top of that the magnification that comes when you've been through abuse and you're still fearful, and it gets absolutely much worse.
you are absolutely correct about that. And that's where we see like a lot of self-esteems go down. We see a lot of, the feelings of hopelessness. And when we get down to the hopelessness, it's no secret how many people take their own lives.
Right.
It's just crazy. But when they feel that there's no way out, that's a reality. And a lot of times, like, I had the benefit of seeing that, working on a mental health unit in an acute hospital situation. And then we see other things. We see, ineffective coping. We see, people go into drugs or to alcohol, or even
Right.
risky business by having unhealthy relationships just to be able to gain some acceptance. So there's a lot of tributaries when something like that happens.
Absolutely. And one thing I would like to add to divorce professionals is that if you are going, or to anyone, if you're going to suggest to a victim to leave, make sure that they have the professional resources and a safety plan before they exit, because there can be a lot of dangerous advice out there from friends and family and Facebook groups and that kind of thing. And I think it's important to understand that just leaving isn't a matter of just walking out the door and you live happily ever after.
Yeah, and I think also it's important that it's their plan. And instead of still going to that, telling them what to do,
Right.
because we want to empower that. But you bring up a very good point, because one of the things that I say is like an oldie but goodie. And I think that if we can go back, for those that are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and
Hmm.
this was developed back in 1943. It was a theory of motivation. And listeners can look up the pyramid, because it really says a lot. And if we look at the pyramid, there's 5 foundational levels of that pyramid. And at the very base of that pyramid is the meeting of the physiological needs. And that would be, being able to breathe, being able to eat, being able
Hmm.
to drink, being able to hydrate, being able to sleep and reach that homeostasis. So that is the number one thing. And then when we get to the second level, that's when we're talking about exactly what you're saying, the safety, the
Hmm.
security of the body, being able to, if somebody was never allowed to work, and helping them to find maybe some simple employment, so that they can have those finances, so that they can maintain their security, their housing, all of those things. Then
Right.
when you get to that third level, which is that love and that sense of belonging, this is social. So this is like building relationships, having that companionship. the involvement in the community. And the reason why this becomes very important, and
Mhm.
I look at this, and the analogy that I use is that if you had a building that didn't have a solid foundation, and then it was getting the wind and the rain and they were getting pounded, that building is going to collapse. So
Mhm.
when you have a solid foundation, you have these three things in place. This is what's interesting, because there's a natural evolution of the building of self-esteem. So you can't just sit there and say, hey, you have low self-esteem, get that self-esteem. People don't know how that happens. But in this evolution, in this process, after those three pillars are met, the self-esteem naturally goes up. They have that,
Right.
that personal worth, that social recognition, that sense of accomplishment. But this is it, the top of the pyramid. And this is where we want to get to. And they refer to it as self-actualization. And
Right.
really what that means, they become more concerned about themselves. They don't care now about the opinions of other people. So they can shut off what is being said to them by the abuser, and
Mhm.
they become more interested in fulfilling their potentials. So even though that was developed in 1943, I still think that, when people understand what has to take place first in that solid, development, so that that self-esteem and that, that accomplishment, and now they're ready to say, okay, this is what I want, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to do it, and this is where they get to reach what their goals are. However, that's when we get into the skill building. And a lot of times, people really don't know how to get that. And that's why the people who are serving them can offer their assistance. But the first thing, Beverly, as you know, it's the relationship building. It's developing that trust and that rapport. Because when you have trust and rapport with somebody, guess what? You start to get that stimulus control. And when you have
Absolutely.
that stimulus control, then they start to listen. But the people who are serving them, they need to really be conscious of their own cultural competency, their own sensitivity, and their own implicit bias. Now, when we think about cultural competency, what do we think of? We think of an ethnic background. And that is very important, because people with their ethnicity, they respond to things in different ways. But we don't want to stereotype them. That's where the sensitivity comes in. So how does their culture apply to them? But when you have people that are either victims or survivors of domestic violence, they fit in a culture all of their own. And
Right.
one of the things that that sometimes that we of people that have gone through the situation multiple times, and maybe those multiple times looked a little bit different each time,
Yes.
we have to be very careful that we are not letting our own experiences get in the way. And that's where the biases come in, where we are putting what our situation is on the unique situation of the person. And everybody is coming in with different empowerment.
Right.
And we have to be very sensitive to that. And we have to be sensitive to the transference and the countertransference, because, Beverly, if you reminded me of somebody, and, I'm going to respond to you unconsciously based on what my relationship was with the person that you remind me of. And that could
Exactly.
be the way that you look, that could be the way that you talk, the way that you dress. And when you're dealing with somebody, you might remind them of that, and that's the transference. But the countertransference is when they remind you of somebody, and then you're responding to them based on the relationship of what they remind you of, who they remind you of. So when we're doing the effective listening, it's the golden rules. We
Right.
want to be able to clarify so we completely understand what they're saying, that we're not taking it out of context. And that comes through the summarization to make sure that you're understanding and everybody's on the same page. And then respect those boundaries of change, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But when we talk about empowerment, it's really about finding things that we can naturally positively reinforce. Don't get out of the gate by focusing on the negative, but the positive things, because we want to start, that positive empowerment. And just to throw in another thing, we really have to acknowledge what their readiness is. And
Yes.
and that's when I talked about before, that we want to like start out, listening and stay on the course and try to encourage them to come up with their own plan, instead of now having somebody else say, you need to do this, you need to do that, and putting demands on them, because they
Right.
don't have room for any more demands. Understand where their motivation level is, where on that pyramid we have to go all the way back to. Some people may be left homeless. They may not have a support system, those very basic physiological needs. So we can
Hmm.
give them the resources. And then every little thing
Yeah.
where it's a natural praise and positive reinforcement of their accomplishments, we should be, really cognitive too.
I think another thing that some of my clients have experienced, one in particular, was that she had a tremendous amount of documentation and facts about the abuse in her relationship. They went into mediation, and as frequently happens, that abuser can turn on the charm, can turn on the feeling that they are together and kind and loving. And the attorney for my client, even though she had seen all the facts, listened to the abuser and said to the victim, did this really happen? He doesn't seem like he could be the kind of guy to do it. Well, that disbelief and that kind of horrendous statement to me sends a victim back tremendously. So believability and support, I think, become huge in this particular area.
Yeah, and that's very sad, because in this day and age, people should be aware of narcissistic behavior,
Right.
and and conning and manipulation, because how many people, especially your elderly, have been conned,
Hmm.
by those behaviors. And that's why, sometimes when you're not in the field and you don't have that knowledge, I always think that it's very good if there is a therapist, if there is a advocate, that they can provide that education, so that they're not immediately having the victim be victimized again, because
Exactly.
now they are not being heard. And when
Hmm.
they're not being heard, that sets them up for failure. Like, what's the use of even talking about it?
Right.
But that's just a lack of education in the profession. And a lot of times, like, I know that I go into the legal area with attorneys and judges, and I used to be a guardian ad litem, because I would educate them on developmental disabilities, on autism, because they didn't understand that. And if they don't understand domestic violence, and this is where there's a lot of movements through all the various coalitions that I've been part of those discussions with, is that we are getting those needs out so that they can understand that this is manipulative behavior. And then
Yes.
you always want to stay neutral, in that when you're extracting that information, if right out the gate someone says it, and then you say to somebody who has been, abused, well, how could he do something like that? Like, I would just question that on an individual level. I wouldn't stereotype that.
Right.
But I would, and then that person needs a little bit more education. But even through what you do, Beverly, you're offering that education. And sometimes I think that those things should be a little bit mandatory, especially if you're in a family court situation. But I think we're seeing a lot more lobbyists out there trying to give the talks to understand that behavior. So it's just very sad in this day and age that manipulation, which goes on all the time, isn't so readily recognized as a possibility.
Right. I think that is just terrible. So we talked a little bit about the stagnation. So are there, I know what I wanted to say. That is that the divorce professional has to remember that they are serving that client. And many times, if that client comes to you without a voice, without self-esteem, with confusion and emotional turmoil, they're going to turn to that professional and expect them to be the be all and end all and be perfect and have all the answers and make sure that they get a fair deal. And what needs to happen is that victim needs to move toward being their own advocate and remembering that they are the customer of that professional. And so it's important to interview that professional to find out who's right for you. But if they come to us with low self-esteem and things like that, it's going to be hard for them to step into that role of advocating for themselves.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because there's a couple things that I'd like to go back to, like when we're extracting information. Okay, so you're interviewing, you're extracting information, and let's go back to the victim for a moment. It's very important to ask those open-ended questions and avoid those yes or no's, because the yes or the no's or the maybes, they're going to start and they're going to end there. But when you're asking the open-ended question, they may start out by asking the direct question, but they may be adding a little bit of tidbits in there. And that's where the people who are servicing them want to take notes of that. And then what we want to do is we want to reinforce like the positive parts that we're hearing, like turning it around and to really accent and bringing the focus, because that's always going to come back to raising self-esteem and empowering people. So I know I said it before, but reflecting on what was being said, being able to explore and to summarize, to make sure everything is understood so they're not misunderstood, because that can be very frustrating for somebody when they feel like they're not being heard or understood, and that's where they can fall down, and that's where we see regression. And when we see regression, they feel like they're a failure, so we lose their self-esteem. But one of the things that I did, I used to run the groups on the mental health unit, and one of the things that I did was, because I had people who felt like failures, they wanted to take their own lives. I don't think there's more of a failure than that. So I used to draw this circle on the board, and I would simply say, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting. And if you're not getting the result that you're looking for, something has to change. So I would break that circle up so they could see that. So the first thing they start to recognize is, hey, you know what? I've been doing the same thing over and over again. I'm not a failure. And then in the skill building, when people are emotional and they're so caught up in that, we've got to take them out of their brain. Okay. So one of the exercises that I used to do is I used to have them very concretely take a piece of paper, 2 columns, define a relationship, the good things about a relationship, the bad things about a relationship. But what are the three most things are that you will absolutely not tolerate at all? So you can
Right.
have like 20 things in a positive relationship and 5
Right.
things in the negative, but if those negatives are things that you can't get by. So like
Right.
for instance, if somebody doesn't have an open relationship and they don't tolerate cheating, and
Mhm.
they will there's no negotiation, or if somebody is putting them down all the time,
Mhm.
or let's say physical abuse where they hit them. Those are three things.
Sure.
They're there, boom. Then they start to see, hey, that's in my relationship. This is what I defined. What am I doing here? And what
Mhm.
I do, and this is very common and it's very simple, it's very easy to do. I would say, well, what would you tell your best friend if they were in that situation? Because
Right.
many times they have the answers inside of them, but because they're so emotional, they can't speak logically. So when they talk about what they would, advise their best friend, and then you say, well, aren't you your own best friend? And then they can, you can start to help them do that. But the main thing that I saw also, the confusion of the people that I met with, is they really get confused with the sexual compatibility and what love is. So because
Right.
they were
Exactly.
sexually compatible and it felt really good and it felt like they were in just like heaven and everything, they thought that was love.
Right.
And then that's what they're fighting for. They're fighting for a love. So when you can separate love by going back, well, if they're cheating on you, if they're putting you down all the time, if they're hitting you, is that your definition of love? Or, could this be a natural, normal, sexual compatibility? So then they start to, still make their own decision. So you're just giving them the tools and they can answer. And once it's them answering, instead of us telling them, then they're more apt to listen. But one of the things that you had brought up, and I think this is very important, is that we really have to look at where the person is in the stages of change. So,
Right.
for instance, first there's the shock. Okay. So they may initially feel inadequate, question their self-worth. They might have guilt feelings, but the thing about guilt, and this is where all of us who serve people, we should be very much aware of the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is when a person feels that they did something wrong. Shame is when they feel like they are something wrong. And
Very
that's
good point.
a really big difference, because that's when we get into the depressions and the suicides and everything else like
Right.
that. However, then they go into the second stage, and the second stage is anger. So, first, it's towards the abuser, okay? But then they can turn it easily onto themselves. And you might be able to relate to this, Beverly. If I had only, how did
Oh
I
yeah.
get myself into this again? Okay. And that's when I changed my self talk. Hey, the only thing I'm guilty of is I trusted this person. I
Mhm.
believed what they were saying was the truth. So I changed that around. But then we get into bargaining. Now, when we get into bargaining, they may start to feel very ambivalent. How many times do we see this? Okay. So now they're asking for the change not to occur. Okay.
Right.
And that's happening because they're just so fatigued. They're just so overwhelmed. And then we see the depression. But why does that happen? It happens because there's too much attention to the situation itself. And when there's too much attention to the situation itself, instead of that one traumatic event, because of the perseverative thoughts, now they have 50 traumatic events. And
Right.
with those multiple traumas, they feel like nobody cares. And
Yeah.
then something that I just want to briefly bring up, which is the trauma silence. So many people don't feel comfortable in a conversation when it becomes silence. When it's silent, this is very important. when there's trauma, because we only want them to speak when they're ready to speak. And just embrace that silence. And if that silence is going on, you can make an acknowledgement. You can say, I see that this is very concerning, for you. We don't have to talk about it now, but, when you're ready, I want you to know that I'm here for you. So
Right.
we have to get comfortable with that silence. And then once we move into the acceptance, and this is the difficult part. So when they move into the acceptance part, now remember, this is their plan. So they may be ready to move forward. Some people may not. Some people may feel right now it's better for them to stay. So if you challenge them, you are going to lose them in that trust, that rapport, that stimulus control, because now they're getting triggered again. Somebody's telling them what to say, and what they're saying is wrong. And they've already been through a battering of this. But what you want to do is, you want to reinforce that you're there for them. And then what you want to do is you want to tell them, what? I want to follow up with you. And you actually take the time to set a time and a date. That may be a week later. Okay.
Yeah.
Because they're feeling ambivalent right now. And, maybe they need one more punch in the face to wake them up again. Okay. And this is building the trust, and this is allowing you to follow up, because there's so many times that we don't want to lose that stimulus control.
Right.
And
Joni,
we don't want to abuse them too,
Yeah, we're coming to the end of our time, and I could go on for hours with you. Will you come back? We didn't even get to the question about how a professional can prepare a victim for court and so many other things. So if you'd come back, we would love to have you.
That would be perfectly fine. I didn't know that the 40 minutes went up already. Boy, time sure flies when you're having fun, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being my guest. It's been fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And to the audience, thank you for being our guest on this episode of Divorce Coalition Live. If you would like to listen to this episode again, you can go to divorcecoalition.com on the live show tab. All of Joni's information will be available in the show notes. The Divorce Coalition is the nonprofit organization created to change the experience in divorce of abuse victims and survivors. For more information, go to divorcecoalition.com. We would appreciate your tax-deductible donation at divorcecoalition.com/donate-now. And we have a special gift for you, a free ebook called Stop Condoning Domestic Violence. And the information will be in our show notes. Let's come together, champion a brighter future, and change the face of divorce for abuse survivors. Stay tuned next week for another episode of Divorce Coalition Live. If you have questions or would like to contact me, email me at beverly@divorcecoalition.com. Until next time, keep learning, stay safe, and grow. Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly.